John chapter 9 as we began to introduce our study into this new chapter this morning. If you'll notice in this chapter, we have the healing of a man that was born blind, and it pretty much encompasses the entire chapter, so I'm not going to take the time to read that entire chapter. We might be here for a little while if I do that. But I do want to read the first 12 verses, which is what we will be looking at for the next couple of weeks. John chapter 9, beginning at verse 1. As he passed by, he saw a man blind from birth. And his disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he would be born blind?" Jesus answered, "It was neither that this man sinned nor his parents, but it was so that the works of God might be displayed in him. We must work the works of him who sent me, as long as it is his day. Night is coming when no one can work. While I am in the world, I am the light of the world." When he said this, he spat on the ground, made a clay of spittle, and applied the clay to his eyes. And he said to him, "Go wash in the pool of Siloam," which translated, sent. So he went away and washed and came back seeing. Therefore the neighbors and those who previously saw him as a beggar were saying, "Is not this the one who used to sit and beg?" Others were saying, "This is he." Still others were asking, "No, but he is like him." And he kept saying, "I am the one." So they were saying to him, "How then were your eyes opened?" He answered, "The man who is called Jesus made clay and anointed my eyes and said to me, 'Go wash in the pool of Siloam.' And so I went away and washed, and I received sight." They said to him, "Where is he?" He said, "I do not know." As we begin looking at this section here, it raises a question for us. Certainly we see God healing at this time, and specifically seeing the Lord Jesus right here healing. But the obvious question is does God heal today? And so as we look at this, I want to begin to approach this section by addressing this particular question. And to do that, just hold your place right there and go forward into 1 Corinthians chapter 12, and look at verse 9. 1 Corinthians 12 and verse 9. You'll notice in 1 Corinthians 12 that it mentions spiritual gifts. And in those spiritual gifts, we have the categories of those gifts mentioned beginning at verse 8, and they come down to verse 10. And if you'll notice there in verse 9, he says, right in the middle of the verse, "To another, gifts of healing by the one Spirit." Gift of healing. Now, there's certainly a differing of opinions on whether this gift is still functional or whether this gift has ceased. Same is true about some of the other gifts that are listed here in this chapter. But as we look at this, I want to first define some terms. And so look down again at verse 9, and you'll notice as he says there, "To another, gifts." And stop right there. The word gifts is the word charisma. I'm sure that you have heard of that. I think that there's a magazine with that title. Or maybe you have heard of a longer use of the word charismatic. And that word charismatic, though it's used today to denote a denomination, it is really a word that denotes all Christians. But this word charisma is used here in the plural, and because it's used in the plural, that it's emphasizing the many kind of afflictions that need healing. And Paul is speaking of the categories of giftedness in which there may be a great variety. Now, the word literally means this, a gift of grace, or just to shorten it, grace gifts. In fact, in the parallel passage over in Romans chapter 12, he uses the word grace, and it carries that same kind of definition. He says in verse 3, "For through the grace given to me," and then down in verse 6, "Since we have gifts that differ according to the grace given to us," then he says, "Let us use them." So the word literally means a gift of grace. When we experience the spiritual gifts that come from God's children, we are experiencing a gift of grace. Now, notice that word is used back in 1 Corinthians 12, down in verse 4. He says there are a variety of gifts. He uses it, of course, in verse 9 that we just read. Then he uses it in verse 28 when he says gifts of healings. And then he uses it in verses 30 and 31. He says, all do not have gifts of healings, do they? All do not speak with tongues, do they? All do not interpret, do they? But earnestly desire the greater gifts. And so you see the word gifts mentioned again. Now the second word that I'd like for us to define back in verse 9 is the word healing. That is the Greek word aiomai. And it implies a complete restoration. It could be restoration from an organic or a functional disease, or it could even be a restoration of a limb. Now I want to illustrate this first by having to turn to Matthew chapter 8, and let's see how this word healing is used throughout the New Testament. Matthew chapter 8. And beginning at verse 1. It says, when Jesus came down from the mountain, large crowds followed him. And a leper came to him and bowed down before him and said, Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean. Jesus stretched out his hand and touched him, saying, I am willing, be cleansed. And immediately his leprosy was cleansed. And Jesus said to him, see that you tell no one, but go show yourself to the priest and present the offering that Moses commanded as a testimony to them. Now it says there that a leper came to him. Here is a man with leprosy. This idea of this disease was a spongy tumor-like swelling which would grow on the face and the body. It would affect the natural organs. It would cause the bones to deteriorate. In fact, in a book called Unclean, Unclean, he describes some of the horrors of leprosy. He says, the disease which we call today leprosy generally begins with pain in certain areas of the body. Numbness follows. Soon the skin in such spots loses its original color. It gets to be thick, glossy, and scaly. As the sickness progresses, the thickened spots become dirty sores and ulcers due to poor blood supply. The skin, especially around the eyes and ears, begins to bunch with deep furrows between the swellings, so that the face of the afflicted individual begins to resemble that of a lion. Fingers drop off or are absorbed. Toes are affected similarly. Eyebrows and eyelashes drop out. By this time, one can see the person in this pitiful condition is a leper. And by a touch of the finger, one can also feel it. One can even smell it, for the leper emits a very unpleasant odor. Moreover, in view of the fact that the disease-producing agent frequently also attacks the larynx, the leper's voice acquires a grating quality. His throat becomes hoarse, and you can now not only see, feel, and smell the leper, but you can hear his rasping voice. And if you stay with him for some time, you can even imagine a particular taste in your mouth, probably due to the odor. Now, some today have referred to this disease as Hansen's disease because it carries the same kinds of characteristics. The interesting thing here, in fact, there are two things that are very interesting. First of all, is that a leper came to Jesus, or the fact that a leper came to anyone. Because to have such a disease, you were banished from society. And there was also shame associated with that. So you usually didn't appear in public with anyone else that didn't have this disease. So you really see this man's faith as he comes to Jesus, and he puts aside all kinds of precaution. In fact, we're told that in Leviticus chapter 5 and verse 3, when you see here Jesus also responding to him and even touching him, that they were forbidden by the Mosaic law to touch a leper because they were unclean. To do so would to expose themselves both to ceremonial and physical contamination. The Talmud, which is a collection of Jewish tradition, it said that you could not get any closer than 6 feet to a leper, and if the wind was blowing, 150 feet. So there was all kinds of precaution here. But this man had put